In terms of background colors for an oral presentation, using a very dark blue is a nice way to go, as I've shown in many of the slides in this presentation, often with a white or yellow text. A lot of the commercial packages have these so-called themes or designs, and maybe using one or two on occasion at the very beginning and the end can be okay, but they're heavily overused, very distracting, and often have people looking at kind of what you're doing rather than the information that you're trying to get across. In terms of fonts, I would emphasize the use of the sans serif fonts like Arial, as opposed to the so-called serif fonts like Times Roman. Those fonts are really the kind of font you want to use if you're reading a book. If you're looking at a lot of text, they make it actually much easier to read. But in a graphical display, the Arial fonts, or the fonts without the serifs, are cleaner, crisper, and generally lead to better communication of the information. And as you may be able to see here, with something small like this, it's just simply easier to see if it's in a serif font like Arial than if it's in a, if it's in a sans serif font like Arial than if it's in a serif font like Times Roman. Also, using all capital letters is difficult to read. And of course, the font needs to be big enough so that you can read it in whatever context it is. There's a number of issues in terms of production and reproduction. It's important to test your equipment or your devices prior to any type of presentation or prior to going into any production mode with written material. You need to test the printers, your laptops, LCDs, and the printers themselves. The use of color can vary between an oral presentation compared to written works, reports, or manuscripts. You don't always have the color option for written material, and it can be expensive to reproduce or even produce it in color in terms of the written works. Also, for producing posters, large displays for scientific meetings or for health education material, there's different issues that need to be considered in terms of large-scale plotters that are available for making those types of visual displays. One issue I want to discuss is the use of 3D charts and figures. The main point I want to make is that they should be avoided. 3D is the default in a lot of pieces of software, and it's just showy and glitzy and leads to a loss of information by and large. On occasion, there are actually 3 dimensions, and in those instances, there can be an effective way to present complex data. But here's an example, the simple pie chart I showed you a while ago of the distribution of the California population by race and ethnicity. And here's the same chart as a 3D chart. It's one click of the mouse in most pieces of software, but it's a loss of a lot of information. You can see that the slices that are closer to us gain the surface area, so the apparent size of those pieces increases, and the slices that are in the back decrease. And this, of course, is particularly true if slices are very similar size. If one's in the front and one's in the back, the one in front is going to look a lot bigger just because of that surface area distortion. So this avoidance of 3D charts is true not just with pie charts, but also with bar charts where you see them overused heavily, and even line charts. The notion of chart junk is when extraneous information is added that really detracts from the information you're trying to communicate. Here's an example using the familiar chart we've seen before, where instead of just simple bars showing the height of the figure, we had this sort of cutesy nurse giving the kid an injection. And people are looking at, what is that? What's going on? Rather than looking at the information you're trying to communicate. On occasion, perhaps a little bit of this does keep an audience interest if you think you need something like that, but overwhelmingly it should be the data itself, the story you're trying to tell, the information that keeps the audience's attention, and avoiding this sort of thing. And certainly this sort of thing in a 3D format with a weird font and a little picture here and there is really a distraction and is completely to be avoided. Here's another type of thing called infographic that you see in the press a lot. And USA Today is sort of famous for producing these. They always have some infographic on their front page. And here, this is meant to be a sort of vertical bar chart where the arms of this germ are representing how much bacteria is found on phones, desktop computers, fax machine, and toilet. But it's maybe fun to look at, but not a good way to communicate public health information. In conclusion, I want to show you a couple things I worked on some time ago. This is a table showing the serologic results from a project we did involving street-recruited injection drug users in New Mexico. And this table is intentionally shown in the format that us epidemiologists use mostly to communicate with one another, where I'm showing for HBV, hepatitis B, then hepatitis C, and HIV, the number of people we tested, the percent of them who were positive, and the 95% confidence intervals, a statistical assessment related to the precision of the percent positivity. And this is a very useful and important way to communicate information among scientists and the public health community and public in general in some instances. But it's also a little bit dry and a little bit difficult for some people to understand. Another way these data could be shown are using this series of 3 pie charts, where we see HIV very low, hepatitis B quite a bit in the yellow, and hepatitis C a lot. And this format is a little bit more interpretable for some audiences. And in fact, we use this exact chart in sort of poster size in the New Mexico State Legislature to try and show the importance of this situation and convince them to pass legislation to address this particular problem. And I might add, we were successful in that, and very effective measures have been introduced in New Mexico dealing with this issue. Here's a third way these data could be presented, and admittedly, it is somewhat of an infographic type format, but for audience or your effective population of injection drug users, communicating it here where the syringes themselves show the size of the hepatitis C, B, and HIV problem could be a very effective way to present this information. In conclusion, I'd like to emphasize that we should be making displays that matter, show important information. You need to know your audience. You need to think about the range of quite simple for some audiences to much more complex and rich for other audiences. You need to think about the notion that less is more. Sometimes by having things simple, removing things, you can actually communicate more information and communicate it better. And you need to pay attention to the details, the nuts and bolts of technically making the graphics and figures look proper. For more information on this topic, please feel free to email me, msamuel@dhs.ca.gov. I do get a fair bit of email, but I will get back to you if you have any questions related to this or would like additional resources related to this topic. I'd like to thank you very much for listening to the presentation, and I hope you found it useful.